The bonfire burned high against the winter sky, sparks rising like scattered stars over the gathered pack. Ara stood at the edge of the crowd, her breath visible in the frozen air, her fingers wrapped tight around a cup of spiced wine she hadn't tasted. The New Year's Eve celebration roared around her, but she heard only the pounding of her own heart as Alpha King Veyron stepped onto the stone platform at the circle's center. He was exactly as the whispers had described him. Tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair pulled back to reveal a face marked by old scars and newer shadows. His eyes swept the assembly with a weariness that sat strangely on someone so young. 30, perhaps, maybe less. The firelight caught the silver threading through his temples, premature gray that spoke of burdens carried too long. Ara's chest tightened. The pull was there, faint but undeniable, like a cord drawn taut between them across the space and noise. She had felt it the moment she'd arrived at court 3 months ago, had spent every day since trying to convince herself it meant nothing. If you believe in second chances like this story does, make sure you're subscribed for more. Veyron raised one hand and the crowd fell silent. Even the children stopped their running. The pack turned toward their king with a reverence that felt both ancient and fragile, as though they knew something was about to break. "My people," Veyron began, his voice carrying easily over the gathering, "we stand at the threshold of a new year, a new era, and I will not lead you into it while chained to the past." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Ara's fingers went numb around her cup. "Tonight," Veyron continued, "I reject the bond law that has governed our kind for 1,000 years. The murmurs became gasps. Someone dropped a plate. The sound shattered across the sudden quiet. Ara couldn't breathe. She watched as a young woman was pushed forward from the opposite side of the fire. The girl stumbled, caught herself, looked up at Veyron with wide, desperate eyes. She was lovely, dark-haired and delicate, her hands trembling as she reached toward him. "Mira of the Northern Ridge," Veyron said, his tone not unkind but utterly without warmth. "You were presented to me this evening as my fated mate. The council assured me the signs were clear, the bond undeniable." Mira's lips parted. Hope and fear warred across her face. "I do not accept it," Veyron said. The girl staggered as though struck. An older woman, her mother perhaps, caught her before she fell. "The bond law is outdated," Veyron went on, his gaze moving past Mira to sweep the entire assembly. "It has caused more suffering than joy, bound wolves to partners they did not choose, destroyed lives in the name of destiny. My own parents." He paused. The firelight threw his scars into sharp relief. "My own parents were fated mates, and their bond was a poison that nearly broke this pack." Ara's grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "The next Alpha King will either restore the old ways or destroy them. You will know him by his scars and his sorrow, and you, little Moonseer, will have to choose which path he walks." "From this day forward," Veyron declared, "no wolf will be forced to accept a mate they do not want. No bond will be honored above consent. We will choose our own partners, build our own futures, and we will be stronger for it." The crowd erupted. Some cheered. Others shouted protests. The council members on the platform looked as though they'd swallowed glass. Mira was being led away, sobbing into her mother's shoulder, and Veyron stood alone at the center of it all, his expression carved from stone. Ara set down her cup before she dropped it. The pull in her chest had become an ache. She pressed one hand to her ribs, willing it to fade, willing the truth to stay buried. She was the last of the Moonseer bloodline, the final thread connecting this pack to the ancient magic that had made bond law sacred. Her grandmother had died 6 months ago, whispering warnings and prophecies Ara still didn't fully understand. And she had come to this court under a false name, hoping only to watch, to witness, to see if the Alpha King her grandmother had spoken of was real. Now she knew. Veyron had just declared war on everything her bloodline had protected for generations. And the bond pulling her toward him, the one she'd been trying to ignore since the day she'd arrived, burned hotter with every word he spoke. She should leave, slip away into the darkness before anyone noticed. Before the pull grew stronger, before he looked her way and saw something in her face she couldn't hide. But she didn't move. Veyron descended from the platform. The crowd parted for him, some bowing, others turning away in anger or confusion. He walked with the steady gait of a man used to being hated and loved in equal measure. His guards trailed behind him, their hands on their weapons, watching the assembly for threats. He passed within 10 feet of where Ara stood. For one brief, impossible moment, his eyes found hers. The world narrowed. The noise faded. There was only the space between them and the sudden, sharp recognition in his gaze, as though he'd been searching for her without knowing it, as though she was the answer to a question he hadn't yet learned to ask. Then someone stepped between them, blocking the view, and the moment shattered. Veyron moved on, his guards closed ranks around him. The crowd swallowed him up, and Ara was left standing alone beside the dying warmth of a brazier, her heart racing and her hands shaking. She had come here to witness, to decide if the prophecy was real. But the fates, it seemed, had other plans. The pull in her chest didn't fade as Veyron disappeared into the night. If anything, it grew stronger. A tether she couldn't sever, a bond she hadn't chosen. Ara closed her eyes and let out a slow, unsteady breath. Around her, the pack began to disperse. Some headed toward the banquet tables. Others gathered in tight knots, arguing in low, fierce voices about what their king had just done. The music started again, hesitant at first, then building back into the wild, joyful rhythm of a people determined to celebrate, despite the fractures showing in their foundation. She should leave, walk back to her small room and the servants, wing and pretend this night had never happened. Instead, she opened her eyes and looked toward the palace, toward the shadows where Veyron had vanished. Her grandmother's voice whispered through her memory one more time. "You will have to choose which path he walks, little one, and he will have to choose whether to walk it alone." Ara pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders and turned away from the fire. The new year had begun, and with it a reckoning neither she nor the Alpha King could escape. Ara didn't sleep that night. She lay on the narrow cot in her room, staring at the beams overhead, while the celebration echoed distantly through the palace walls. Music and laughter, shouts that could have been joy or anger. The pack didn't know what to do with what their king had given them. Freedom felt dangerous when you'd been taught all your life that destiny was safety. She understood that better than most. Her grandmother had raised her in the mountains, far from any pack territory. A cottage tucked into a valley, where the snow fell thick, and the nearest neighbor was a day's walk away. Ara had thought they were simply alone. It wasn't until she was 12 that her grandmother told her the truth. They were in exile. The Moonseer bloodline had been cast out 3 generations ago, when Ara's great-grandmother refused to bless a bond the old Alpha King wanted dissolved. He'd taken a mistress and claimed his fated mate was a mistake. The Moonseer had said, no destiny could not be unmade for convenience. The Alpha had her banished. Stripped your family of title and protection. Declared the Moonseers enemies of the pack. Ara's grandmother had survived, only because she'd fled before the decree was signed. She'd married in secret, raised Ara's mother far from pack lands, and when Ara's parents died in a border skirmish she was too young to remember, her grandmother took her deeper into the wilderness and taught her everything. How to read the old signs, how to feel the threads of bond magic in the air, how to sense when a true match walked past, even if they didn't know it yet, how to hide. Because being the last Moonseer meant being hunted. Some packs would kill her for what she represented. Others would use her, force her to bless bonds that served their politics, chain her gift to their ambition until there was nothing left of her but a tool. So Ara learned to bury the truth, to make herself small and unremarkable. A servant, a scribe, someone who could move through a palace unseen. Her grandmother had died in the autumn, her body giving out quietly one morning while the leaves fell gold outside the window. She'd held Ara's hand and whispered the last prophecy. The next Alpha King will break the bond law or be broken by it. He will need you, little one, even if he doesn't know it. Even if you wish he didn't. You will have to choose which path he walks. And he will have to choose whether to walk it alone. Ara had buried her in the valley and burned the cottage to ash. Then she'd walked south, toward the capital, carrying nothing but a false name and the weight of her bloodline. She'd arrived at the palace in the first cold weeks of winter, applied for a position in the record house, kept her head down, watched, waited, and felt the pull the moment Veyron walked past her in a corridor 3 days after her arrival. It had stolen her breath, left her gripping the edge of a table while he disappeared around a corner, unaware she existed. The bond her grandmother had warned her about, the one that would decide everything. She'd spent 3 months trying to ignore it, trying to convince herself it was just proximity, just the magic in her blood recognizing an alpha's strength. But tonight, when his eyes had found hers across the fire, she'd known the truth. It was real. The bond was real. And he felt it too, even if he didn't understand what it meant. Even if he'd just declared to the entire pack that bonds didn't matter. Ara turned onto her side and pulled the thin blanket higher. Her room was cold. The servants' wing didn't get much heat this far from the main hearths. She could see her breath in the moonlight slanting through the narrow window. She thought about Mira, the girl's face when Veyron rejected her, the hope that had died in her eyes. Ara didn't blame him. She'd seen enough forced bonds in her grandmother's stories to know the damage they caused. Mates who grew to hate each other. Wolves trapped in partnerships that felt like cages. Love that curdled into resentment because it had never been a choice. Veyron's parents must have been like that. She'd heard whispers about the old king and queen, how they'd fought, how the queen had taken lovers, how the king had grown cruel. The palace still carried scars from their reign, literal ones, in some of the older stonework. Claw marks gouged deep into walls. If that was what Veyron had grown up watching, no wonder he wanted to tear the whole system down. But he didn't understand what he was risking. Bond law wasn't just tradition. It was woven into the magic that held packs together. The Moonseers had been its guardians because the bonds were real. Not every match was fated, but the ones that were carried a power that couldn't be replicated, a strength that flowed between true mates and radiated out into the pack. It was the reason some alphas could hold 1,000 wolves in peace, while others struggled to command 100. If Veyron dismantled bond law entirely, he'd weaken the magic, fracture the pack's foundation, and he'd never know until it was too late. Until challengers rose and the bonds that should have held his people loyal frayed into nothing. Ara pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the ache still there, the pull that hadn't faded. She could tell him. Walk into his hall tomorrow and explain what she was, what he was risking, what the bond between them meant. But he'd never believe her. Why would he? She was a servant. A nobody. And he just rejected his supposed fated mate in front of the entire pack. He'd see her claim as manipulation. Another attempt to trap him with destiny. Or worse, he'd believe her. And then she'd become exactly what her grandmother had feared. A tool. A prize. The last Moonseer, used to legitimize whatever the Alpha King decided. Ara closed her eyes. Sleep felt impossible, but she had to try. Tomorrow the palace would be chaos. Council meetings, arguments, wolves demanding answers. She needed to stay invisible. Let the storm pass over her while she decided what to do. The bond hummed quietly in her chest, a warmth that shouldn't have been comforting. She wondered if Veyron was awake too, if he felt the pull and didn't understand it, if he was staring at his own ceiling, replaying the moment their eyes had met, and wondering why a servant girl's gaze had felt like coming home. Ara pulled the blanket over her head and willed herself to stop thinking about him. She failed. Outside, the celebration finally began to fade. The music died. Voices scattered into the night. The palace settled into the deep quiet that came before dawn. And somewhere in the royal wing, the Alpha King who just declared war on destiny lay awake in the dark, haunted by the face of a woman he didn't know and couldn't forget. Neither of them understood yet that the bond pulling them together was stronger than law, stronger than choice, and that the reckoning Ara's grandmother had prophesied had already begun. The new year stretched ahead of them, and with every passing hour, the threads of fate drew tighter. Even if neither of them wanted to admit it, even if both of them would have chosen to walk away, the bond had other plans. The summons arrived before breakfast. Ara was in the record house, cataloging grain shipments from the southern holdings, when a palace guard appeared in the doorway. Young, nervous. His eyes scanned the room until they found her. "You're Ara?" he asked. She looked up slowly, keeping her expression blank. "I am. The council requires you in the East Hall. Immediately." Her stomach dropped. She set down her quill with a steady hand she didn't feel. "May I ask why?" "Didn't say. Just told me to fetch the scribe who came in autumn." He shifted his weight. "Best not keep them waiting." Ara stood, smoothed her skirts, followed him out into the corridor before her hands could start shaking. The palace was already awake, despite the early hour. Servants hurried past carrying trays and linens. Voices echoed from distant rooms, tense and sharp. The aftermath of last night still hung in the air like smoke. She could feel it in the way people moved. Quick, uncertain. A pack that had lost its footing. The guard led her through passages she rarely traveled, wider halls, better light, tapestries on the walls depicting old battles and ancient bonds. She kept her gaze down, her steps quiet. They reached the East Hall, and the guard knocked once before pushing the door open. The council chamber was smaller than she'd expected. A long table dominated the center, surrounded by high-backed chairs. Maps covered one wall, shelves lined another, stuffed with ledgers and scrolls. And at the head of the table stood Veyron. The pull hit her like a fist to the chest. Harder than last night. Closer. Undeniable. She stopped just inside the doorway, her breath catching before she could control it. Veyron's gaze found hers immediately. For a moment, neither of them moved. The same recognition flickered in his eyes, the same confusion. He frowned slightly, as though trying to place a memory that hadn't happened yet. Then one of the council members cleared his throat and the spell broke. "This is the scribe?" The speaker was an older man, gray-haired and stern. He looked Ara up and down with obvious skepticism. "She came highly recommended," another council member said. "A woman, sharp-eyed and elegant. Her work in the archives has been flawless, We need more than flawless, the older man muttered. We need discreet. Veyron leaned back against the table, his arms crossed over his chest. He hadn't stopped looking at her. Leave us, he said quietly. The council members exchanged glances. The woman opened her mouth as if to protest, then seemed to think better of it. They filed out one by one, the door closing softly behind them. Silence filled the space they left behind. Ara stood perfectly still. She didn't trust herself to speak first. Veyron studied her for a long moment. Then he straightened and moved around the table, closer but not close enough to crowd. His movements were careful, controlled. A man used to being threatening without trying. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ara, Your Majesty." "Just Ara?" "Ara Whitefield." The false surname came easily. She'd practiced it 1,000 times. "You've been here 3 months." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Yes." "Working in the archives." "Yes." "And before that?" She met his eyes. Let him see nothing but calm. "I traveled. My family is gone. I needed work." He watched her as though waiting for the lie to show itself. When it didn't, he exhaled slowly and gestured toward one of the chairs. "Sit." Ara sat. Veyron remained standing, pacing to the window and back. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, made the scars on his jaw stand out pale against his skin. "The council has decided I need a record keeper," he said. "Someone to document the bond reformation process, proposals, arguments, decisions, all of it." He stopped pacing and looked at her again. "They believe it will lend legitimacy to the changes if everything is written down, preserved." Ara's pulse quickened. "And you want me to do this?" "I don't particularly care who does it, but the council insisted on someone with no ties to the old families, no allegiances. You're new, you're competent, and apparently you know how to keep your mouth shut." She should refuse. Make an excuse, anything to avoid spending more time near him. Instead, she heard herself say, "I can do that." Veyron's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Relief, maybe. Or resignation. It will mean long hours. Access to closed meetings. You'll hear things that could get you killed if you repeat them to the wrong people. "I understand. Do you?" He moved closer, not threatening, just near. Close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. Close enough that the bond pulled so tight it hurt. "Half the pack thinks I'm a visionary. The other half thinks I'm a traitor. You'll be standing in the middle of that divide, recording every word. It won't be safe." Ara lifted her chin. "I didn't come here for safety." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Then we have that in common." He walked back to the table and picked up a sealed letter, turned it over in his hands without opening it. "The council meets again this afternoon. You'll attend. Bring parchment and ink. Sit in the corner. Write everything down." "Yes, Your Majesty." "And Ara?" He glanced at her. "If you're going to lie, make it convincing." Her blood went cold. "I don't know what you mean." "You know exactly what I mean." He set the letter down. "I don't care what you're running from. Half the people in this palace are hiding something. But don't insult me by pretending you're just a traveling scribe who needed work." She stood slowly, kept her voice even. "What do you think I am?" "I don't know yet." He studied her face. The pull between them hummed in the air, unspoken and impossible to ignore. "But I will." It wasn't a threat, just a promise, a certainty. Ara inclined her head. "Is there anything else, Your Majesty?" "Not for now." She turned toward the door. made it 3 steps before his voice stopped her. "Ara." She looked back. Veyron was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Wary, curious, something deeper that he didn't seem to understand himself. "You were at the bonfire last night," he said. "Most of the palace was. You were standing near the east brazier. By yourself. You looked—" He trailed off, shook his head. "Never mind." But Ara's heart was racing. He'd seen her, really seen her, even in a crowd of hundreds. "I'll see you this afternoon," Veyron said quietly. She left before he could ask anything else. Before the bond could pull her back toward him. Before the truth, she was barely holding inside, could spill out into the space between them. The corridor outside was empty. Ara leaned against the wall and pressed both hands to her chest, willing her heartbeat to slow. Willing the warmth spreading through her ribs to fade. It didn't. She'd just agreed to spend hours in his presence, close enough to hear every word. Close enough to feel the bond grow stronger with every meeting. Close enough that he'd eventually figure out exactly what she was. Ara pushed away from the wall and started walking. She had hours before the council meeting. Time to prepare. Time to shore up her defenses and remind herself why she couldn't afford to let him see the truth. But as she wound her way back through the palace, past windows filled with cold winter light, she couldn't shake the memory of his eyes on hers, or the way he'd looked at her as though she was the answer to a question he hadn't learned to ask. The bond didn't care about her plans, didn't care about safety or secrets or the careful walls she'd built around herself. It only cared that she'd found him. And now there was no walking away. Continuing story. Sections 4. The council meeting lasted 3 hours. Ara sat in the corner as instructed, her quill moving steadily across parchment while voices rose and fell around the table. Arguments about tradition, protests about stability. Veyron's responses were measured, patient. He let them shout themselves hoarse before speaking, and when he did, his words cut through the noise like a blade through silk. She wrote it all down. Every accusation. Every defense. The way the older council members invoked the names of ancestors who'd built their power on bond law. The way the younger ones spoke of wolves they'd known, trapped in matches that had destroyed them. And she felt Veyron's attention on her. Not constantly. Just often enough. A glance when he thought she wasn't looking. A pause in his speech when her quill stilled for a moment. The bond hummed between them, quiet but insistent. She wondered if he felt it too, if he knew what it meant. When the meeting finally ended, the council members filed out in tight clusters, still arguing in hushed voices. Veyron remained at the table, studying a map someone had left unfurled. Trade routes, maybe? Or pack territories. Ara gathered her pages, stacked them carefully. She should leave. Slip out while he was distracted. "Stay," Veyron said without looking up. She froze, set the pages back down, waited. He traced a line on the map with one finger. "You're a good listener?" "It's my job to listen, Your Majesty. Most people hear what they want to hear. You hear what's actually being said." He glanced at her. That's rare. Ara didn't know how to respond to that. She settled for silence. Veyron straightened, rolled up the map with careful hands. "Are you hungry?" The question caught her off guard. Yes, a little. Come on then." He walked past her, out into the corridor, without checking if she followed. Ara grabbed the pages and hurried after him, her heart beating faster than it should. He didn't lead her toward the great hall where the pack ate together. Instead, he turned down a narrower passage, climbing stairs she'd never used before. They emerged onto a covered walkway that connected two wings of the palace. Windows lined both sides, and through them she could see the courtyard below, snow-covered and quiet. At the end of the walkway was a small room. More of a nook, really. A table, 2 chairs, a cabinet against the wall. Veyron opened the cabinet and pulled out bread, cheese, dried fruit. Set it on the table without ceremony. "Not a feast," he said, "but better than nothing." Ara hesitated in the doorway. This felt dangerous, intimate, like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. "Sit," Veyron said. Not an order, an invitation. She sat. He poured water from a pitcher into 2 cups, pushed one toward her. Then he dropped into the chair across from hers and tore off a piece of bread. For a few minutes they ate in silence. The food was simple, but good. Ara hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite. "This was my hiding place when I was a boy," Veyron said eventually. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the window, on the snow falling softly beyond the glass. "When my parents fought, I'd come here, lock the door, pretend I was somewhere else." Ara set down her cup carefully. "Did they fight often?" "Every day." His voice was quiet, matter of fact. They were fated mates. The bond was supposed to make them perfect for each other. Instead, it made them poison. He finally looked at her. "Have you ever seen a bond go wrong?" She thought of her grandmother's stories. The wolves who'd loved and hated in equal measure. The partnerships that became prisons. "Yes, then you understand why I had to break it." "I understand why you want to." Ara chose her words carefully. "But wanting something and knowing how to achieve it aren't the same thing." Veyron's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think I'm making a mistake?" "I think you're trying to fix something that's been broken for a long time. And I think the people who benefit from it being broken won't let you succeed without a fight." He leaned back in his chair, studied her with that same intensity he'd shown in the council chamber. "You're not afraid of me." "Should I be?" "Most people are." He said it without pride, just weariness. "Even the ones who love me." Ara met his gaze and held it. "I'm not most people." Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, interest. The pull between them drew tighter, and she saw the moment he felt it too. The way his breath caught, the way his hand stilled on the table. "Who are you, really?" Veyron asked softly. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning, with the weight of everything she couldn't say. Ara looked down at her hands. "I'm someone who's lost people to tradition, to laws that were supposed to protect us but didn't." She made herself look up again. "I came here because I wanted to see if change was possible. If someone could be strong enough to challenge the old ways without being destroyed by them. It was the truth. Not all of it, but enough." Veyron was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table, stopped just short of touching her hand. "My parents' bond was approved by a Moonseer. Did you know that?" Ara's blood went cold. She kept her face still. "I've heard the stories. The Moonseers swore they were fated, that their bond would bring strength to the pack. Unity." His jaw tightened. "Instead, it brought years of suffering. My mother took lovers, my father grew cruel, and the whole pack watched it happen. Watched the bond that was supposed to be sacred become a nightmare." He pulled his hand back, curled it into a fist on the table. "The Moonseer disappeared before I was old enough to ask why she'd lied," Veyron continued. "My father had her banished, maybe killed, I don't know. But I learned something from watching all of it." He looked at Ara again, and his eyes were hard. haunted. Destiny is just another word for control, and I won't let anyone use it to chain my people ever again. Ara's throat was tight. She understood now. Not just his anger at bond law, but his anger at her bloodline, at everything the Moonseers represented. If he ever learned what she was, he wouldn't see her as a person. He'd see her as the enemy, the symbol of everything that had destroyed his childhood. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For what happened to you? To your family?" Veyron blinked, as though the sympathy surprised him. "It was a long time ago. That doesn't make it hurt less." He stared at her, and for a moment, the walls he kept so carefully maintained seemed to crack. Just a little. Just enough to let her see the exhaustion underneath. The loneliness. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't." The snow fell heavier beyond the windows. The room grew dimmer. Neither of them moved to light a candle. "My family's gone too," Ara heard herself say. The words came without permission, without thought. "I watched my grandmother die 6 months ago. She raised me, taught me everything. And when she was gone, I realized I had nothing left. No home, no purpose." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "So I came here, because I needed to believe something could be rebuilt." Veyron's expression softened. "What did she teach you?" "To listen. To see what people try to hide. To understand that power and strength aren't the same thing." "She sounds wise." She was. Ara's chest ached. She was also stubborn, and certain she knew better than everyone else. She died believing the world would fall apart without her. "And has it?" Ara smiled faintly. "Not yet." Veyron almost smiled back. Almost. "Then maybe she was wrong." "Maybe." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It felt shared. Two people carrying grief they didn't know how to set down. Outside, the sky darkened toward evening. The palace bells rang, distant and low. Veyron stood, began gathering the remains of their meal. "Tomorrow, there's another meeting. Proposals for how to restructure mate selection without bond law. It will be ugly." "I'll be there." He paused, looked at her over his shoulder. "Thank you for—" He trailed off, seemed to search for words, for listening. Ara stood as well. "That's what you're paying me for." "No." He turned to face her fully. "I'm paying you to write things down. You're choosing to listen. There's a difference." The bond hummed between them, stronger now, fed by honesty, by the tentative trust beginning to form in the space where their walls had cracked. Ara picked up her pages, held them against her chest like armor. "I should go. Ara!" She stopped at the door. Veyron was watching her with an expression she couldn't name. Something raw, something real. "I'm glad you're here." Her breath caught. "So am I." She left before either of them could say anything else, before the bond could pull her back, before the truth sitting heavy on her tongue could spill out and ruin everything. But as she walked back through the darkening palace, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the walls between them were thinner than they'd been this morning, and that the reckoning her grandmother had prophesied was drawing closer with every passing hour. The summons came at dawn, 3 days after that quiet meal in Veyron's hiding place. Ara was already awake, lying in the gray light and listening to the palace stir around her, when the knock came. Sharp, urgent. She opened the door to find the same young guard from before, but his nervousness had been replaced by something harder. Fear, maybe, or anger barely held in check. "Council chamber," he said. "Now, the king's orders." Ara didn't waste time asking questions. She dressed quickly, braided her hair, and followed him through corridors that felt too quiet for morning. The usual bustle of servants was absent. Doors stood closed that were normally open. She caught glimpses of faces peering from doorways, eyes wide and worried. Something had happened. The guard left her at the council chamber door without a word. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was crowded, not just the council, but other wolves she didn't recognize. Alphas from neighboring territories, judging by the way they held themselves. Confident, territorial. Their eyes tracked her entrance and dismissed her in the same breath. Veyron stood at the head of the table. He looked like he hadn't slept. The shadows under his eyes were darker than she'd seen them, and his jaw was tight with tension that radiated through the room like heat. He saw her, nodded once toward the corner where she usually sat. Ara moved to her place, set out parchment and ink with hands that wanted to shake. The bond was pulling harder than ever, not just attraction now, something closer to distress, as though it could feel his anger and didn't know what to do with it. "Now that we're all here," one of the visiting alphas said, his voice cutting through the tense silence, "perhaps you'll explain yourself." Veyron's expression didn't change. "I don't answer to you, Marcus. You answer to the pack laws that bind all of us." Marcus was older, gray-haired, with scars that spoke of decades of leadership. "And you've just violated the oldest one." "I violated nothing. You rejected your fated mate in front of your entire pack." Another voice. A woman alpha, sharp-eyed and cold. "You declared bond law invalid, and now you expect the rest of us to simply accept your authority? I expect you to respect my right to govern my own territory." Marcus slammed his hand on the table. "Your authority comes from your bloodline, from the bonds that connect you to your pack and your pack to the land. If you sever those bonds, you sever your right to rule." The room erupted, voices overlapping, arguments crashing into each other. Ara's quill moved across the parchment, capturing what she could, but her attention was fixed on Veyron. He stood perfectly still in the center of the storm, waiting. Finally, the noise died down enough for him to speak. "My authority," Veyron said quietly, "comes from my ability to protect and lead my people, not from a bond I didn't choose, not from a system that's caused as much harm as good." He looked at each of the visiting alphas in turn. "If you're here to challenge me, Marcus, then make your challenge, but don't hide behind tradition and call it law." Marcus smiled. It wasn't pleasant. "I'm not here to challenge you. I'm here to offer you a chance to correct your mistake before it's too late." "What mistake? You have no marked mate, no bond to anchor your authority. By pack law, that makes your position unstable." Marcus glanced at the other alphas. "We've discussed this, among ourselves and with your own council. The consensus is clear. If you want to remain Alpha King, you need to choose a mate by the end of this week. A public bonding, witnessed and blessed. It doesn't have to be the girl you rejected, but it has to be someone." Veyron's hands curled into fists on the table. "And if I refuse, then we'll call a conclave. Put your leadership to a vote. And I think you'll find that most of the Northern Territories aren't interested in following an alpha who rejects the very foundations of pack law." The threat hung in the air. Clear. Unmistakable. Ara's chest tightened. She could feel the bond straining, could feel Veyron's fury radiating through it, even though his expression remained calm. One of Veyron's council members cleared her throat, the sharp-eyed woman who'd recommended Ara weeks ago. "The law Marcus is citing is technically valid. An unmated alpha can be challenged at any conclave. It's meant as a safeguard, To ensure leadership stability. It's meant, Veyron said coldly, to control alphas who don't fall in line. Perhaps. The councilwoman didn't flinch. But it's still law, and Marcus isn't wrong. If you refuse to take a mate, the other territories will have grounds to question your authority. Veyron looked at her for a long moment. Then his gaze swept the room, landed briefly on Ara before moving on. You're asking me to undo everything I declared 3 nights ago. To pretend I believe in a system I know is broken. We're asking you to be strategic, Marcus said. Choose someone. Make it look legitimate. You can restructure bond law all you want once your position is secure. But right now you're vulnerable. And there are wolves who would be happy to see you fall. The words were reasonable, practical, and they made Ara's stomach turn. Because she could see what they were really asking. They wanted Veyron to pick a mate for politics. To use someone the same way he'd watched his parents use each other. To become the very thing he'd been trying to escape. Veyron was silent for a long time. The room waited. Even the visiting alphas seemed to sense they'd pushed as far as they could. I'll consider it, Veyron said finally. His voice was flat, empty. You'll have my answer in 3 days. Marcus nodded. Satisfied. The other alphas relaxed slightly. The crisis, for now, had been averted. They filed out one by one. The council members lingered, murmuring among themselves, but eventually they left too, until only Ara and Veyron remained. The silence was suffocating. Veyron stood at the table, staring down at the maps and documents scattered across its surface. His shoulders were rigid, his breathing too controlled. Ara set down her quill. She should leave, give him space. But the bond wouldn't let her move. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Veyron's head snapped up. He looked at her as though he'd forgotten she was there. For what? For what they're asking you to do. He laughed. A short, bitter sound. They're not asking, they're demanding. There's a difference. You could refuse, and lose everything I've been trying to build. He pushed away from the table, paced to the window. They'd call a conclave. Marcus would challenge me. And half my own council would support him, because they're terrified of change. His hands clenched on the windowsill. I'd be removed. Exiled, maybe. And whoever took my place would reinstate bond law within a week. Ara stood slowly, moved closer but not too close. So you'll choose someone. I don't have a choice. You always have a choice. He turned to face her. The raw pain in his eyes stole her breath. Do I? Because from where I'm standing, every option leads to betraying either myself or my people. He took a step toward her. Tell me, Ara, if you were in my position, what would you do? The question cut deeper than he knew. Because she was in a position. She had information that could change everything. Her bloodline. Her gift. The fact that the bond between them was real and verified, and powerful enough to silence every doubt Marcus had raised. She could tell him. Right now. Prove his legitimacy beyond question. But it would mean exposing herself, becoming the very thing he hated. The symbol of a system that had destroyed his family. I don't know, she said. It was the only honest answer she had. Veyron searched her face, looking for something, a solution, a way out. I can't do what they're asking. I can't use someone like that. But I can't lose my authority either. Not when I'm this close to making real change. The bond pulled tighter. Ara could feel his anguish. Could feel the weight pressing down on him. And she realized, with sudden clarity, that this was the moment her grandmother had warned her about. The moment where she had to choose. Stay silent and watch him fall, or speak and risk everything. There might be another way, Ara heard herself say. Veyron went still. What way? Her heart was pounding. Her hands were shaking. But the words came anyway, pulled from some deep place she hadn't known existed. What if you could prove your bond was legitimate? Real enough to satisfy the old laws without forcing you to accept someone you don't choose? How? Veyron's voice was barely above a whisper. The Moonseers are gone. There's no one left who can verify bonds. Ara met his eyes, felt the bond singing between them, felt the truth rising in her throat like a tide she couldn't hold back. That's not entirely true, she said softly, and watched understanding begin to dawn in his expression. The understanding in Veyron's eyes shifted to something sharper, harder. He took a step back, creating distance between them. What are you saying? Ara's hands were trembling. She clasped them together to still them. I'm saying the Moonseers aren't all gone. One remains. The silence stretched, heavy enough to crush. Veyron's expression went cold. You. It wasn't a question. The certainty in his voice cut through her like a blade. Yes. He turned away from her, moved to the window. His shoulders were rigid with tension that made the bond ache in her chest. How long have you known? His voice was too quiet, too controlled. That I'm a Moonseer? All my life. That's not what I'm asking. He looked at her over his shoulder. How long have you known about the bond between us? Ara's throat tightened. 3 days after I arrived. You walked past me in the east corridor. I felt it then. 3 months. Veyron's jaw clenched. You've been here 3 months, watching me, writing down every word I said about bond law, about how much I hate the system, about what the Moonseers did to my family. He turned fully. The anger in his eyes was cold and bright. And you didn't think that was something I should know? I couldn't tell you. Why not? Because of this. She gestured between them, at the fury radiating from him, at the distance he'd put between them. Because I knew you'd see me as the enemy, as everything you've been fighting against. You are everything I've been fighting against. The words hit like a physical blow. Ara felt the bond flinch, felt the connection between them strain under the weight of his anger. I'm not your enemy, Veyron. You're a Moonseer. Your bloodline blessed the bond that destroyed my childhood, that gave my father an excuse to be cruel, and my mother an excuse to be faithless. He moved closer, not threatening, just cold. You represent a system built on control, on forcing people into matches they don't want, on calling it destiny when it's just another form of chains. That's not what the gift is for. Then tell me what it's for. His voice was hard. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a convenient way to legitimize whatever the people in power want. Ara took a breath, made herself speak calmly, even though her heart was racing. The gift allows us to see true bonds, not create them, not force them, just recognize them when they exist. And you're saying we have one? Yes. Veyron laughed. The sound was bitter. Of course we do. How convenient for you. The last Moonseer just happens to be fated to the Alpha King, who's trying to dismantle bond law. What a perfect way to trap me. I'm not trying to trap you. Then why tell me now? He watched her with eyes that were too sharp, too knowing. 3 months of silence. And suddenly, the day I'm backed into a corner by Marcus and the other alphas, you reveal you're a Moonseer who can verify bonds. He shook his head. That's not coincidence. That's manipulation. You asked me for another way. I gave you one. You gave me a cage. Veyron's voice dropped. If I claim you as my mate, I prove Marcus wrong. I secure my position. But I also prove myself a hypocrite. Everything I said about choice becomes meaningless if I accept a fated bond the moment it's politically convenient. Ara's chest ached. The bond was pulling so hard it hurt. You're right, she said quietly. If you claim me just to satisfy the council, you become what you hate. But that's not what I'm offering. Then what are you offering? She moved closer. Just a step. Enough that she could see the gold flecks in his eyes. The truth. That bonds exist. That some of them are real and powerful and worth protecting. But that doesn't mean they have to be chains. She made herself hold his gaze. My grandmother blessed your parents. Bond because she saw the connection between them. What she didn't see was that connection alone isn't enough. They had a bond, but they didn't have respect, or kindness, or the will to choose each other every day. Veyron was listening now. The anger in his expression hadn't faded, but something else was there too. Uncertainty. Maybe even pain. The bond between us is real, Ara continued. I can feel it. And I think you can too. But feeling it doesn't mean we're trapped by it. It just means we have something worth considering. Something we could choose. Together. And if I don't choose it? The question hurt more than it should have. Then you don't. I'll leave. Go back into exile. And you'll find another way to prove your authority. Veyron stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned away again. My father used to say the bond made him do things. Made him angry. Made him cruel. That he couldn't help it because the pull was too strong. His voice was quiet. Raw. I watched him use that bond as an excuse for years. Watched him hurt people and call it destiny. He looked at her over his shoulder. How do I know this isn't the same thing? How do I know the bond between us won't become another excuse? Another cage? Ara felt something crack open in her chest. Not the bond. Something deeper. You don't, she said honestly. You can't know. No one can. That's what choice means. It's a risk. And it's terrifying. She took another step closer. But I can tell you this. The bond didn't make your father cruel. His choices did. The bond just gave him power. What he did with that power was his own. Veyron closed his eyes. His shoulders sagged slightly, as though the weight he'd been carrying had finally become too much. I don't know what to do, he said. The admission sounded like it cost him. Then don't do anything. Not yet. He opened his eyes, looked at her with something that might have been hope. Or desperation. You said I have 3 days to give Marcus an answer. Use that time. Ask me anything you want. Test the bond. See if it feels like a cage or a choice. She held out her hand. Not touching. Just offering. And then decide. Veyron stared at her outstretched hand. The bond hummed in the space between them. Warm. Insistent. Slowly, he reached out. His fingers brushed hers. Just barely. Just enough to send heat racing up her arm. The bond flared. Bright and certain and undeniable. Veyron sucked in a breath. His hand closed around hers, and for a moment neither of them moved. I feel it, he said quietly. "I felt it since the bonfire. Since before that, maybe. I just didn't know what it was. And now? Now I know." He looked at their joined hands, then at her face. "And I still don't know what to do with it." Ara smiled faintly. "Then we're even." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. He released her hand, stepped back, but the coldness in his expression had thawed. "Just a little." 3 days, Veyron said. "I'll give you 3 days. We'll talk. You'll answer my questions. And at the end, I'll decide whether this bond is something I can choose, or something I need to walk away from. That's all I'm asking." He nodded slowly, looked toward the window where the morning light was growing stronger. "Marcus will be watching. So will the council. They'll notice if we spend time together." "Let them notice." Veyron glanced at her. Something like respect flickered in his eyes. "You're braver than I thought. Or more foolish." Maybe both. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was uncertain. Two people standing at the edge of something they couldn't see clearly, trying to decide whether to step forward or turn back. Finally, Veyron moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the handle. "Ara," she looked up. "Thank you for telling me. Even if I don't. Even if this doesn't." He trailed off, shook his head. "Just, thank you." He left before she could respond. Ara stood alone in the empty council chamber, her hand still warm where he'd touched it, the bond still humming in her chest. She'd done it, told him the truth, offered him the choice her grandmother had prophesied. And now all she could do was wait. Wait, and hope that 3 days would be enough. That the bond between them was strong enough to survive his anger, his fear, his history. That he would see her not as a symbol, not as a trap, but as a person who'd chosen to stand beside him, even knowing the risk. The morning light filled the room, warm despite the winter cold. And somewhere in the distance, the palace bells began to ring. The 3 days passed like a slow burn, hours spent in quiet rooms with Veyron, answering questions he asked with careful precision. What did the gift feel like? How did she know a bond was real? Could it be wrong? She answered every question honestly. Showed him the ways she'd learned to sense connections between wolves, the warmth that meant compatibility, the pull that meant something deeper, the absolute certainty that came with a true bond. He listened, watched her with those sharp, gold-flecked eyes, and slowly the anger faded into something more complex. Wariness mixed with curiosity, fear balanced by cautious trust. They walked through the snow-covered gardens on the second day. Veyron told her about his childhood, not the broad strokes she already knew, but the details. The way his mother used to sing before the bond turned sour. How his father had been kind once, before bitterness consumed him. Ara shared pieces of her own past in return. Her grandmother's stubbornness, the weight of being the last of her line, the loneliness of carrying a gift no one wanted anymore. The bond grew stronger with each conversation, not demanding, just present, a steady warmth in her chest that seemed to echo in him. On the third evening, Veyron found her in the library where she'd been transcribing the latest council notes. The room was empty except for dying firelight and the smell of old paper. He sat down across from her without speaking, just looked at her for a long moment. "I've made my decision," he said finally. Ara's heart stuttered. She set down her quill with a steady hand she didn't feel. "And? I'm going to call a gathering. Tomorrow night. The full pack and the visiting alphas." His expression was calm, resolved. "I'm going to make a formal claim." Relief and terror crashed through her in equal measure. "You're certain?" "No." He leaned forward slightly. "But I'm choosing it anyway. That's what you said, wasn't it? That choice is a risk." "Yes." "Then I'm taking the risk." His eyes searched hers. "But I need you to understand something. I'm not claiming you because of the bond, not just because of it." Ara's throat tightened. "Then why?" "Because in 3 days, you've shown me more honesty than most people manage in a lifetime. Because you stood in front of me and offered me a choice, even when it would have been easier to manipulate me. Because when I look at you, I don't see a cage. I see—" He trailed off, shook his head. "I see someone brave enough to let me decide, even knowing I might walk away." He stood, moved to the window. The moonlight caught the silver in his hair. "I'm not going to claim you as a fated mate. Not the way the old laws define it. I'm going to claim you as my chosen partner. And I'm going to rewrite the bond law to reflect that difference." Ara rose slowly. "What difference?" "That bonds can be real without being compulsory. That recognizing a connection doesn't mean surrendering your will to it." He looked at her over his shoulder. "You'll stand beside me tomorrow night. You'll use your gift to verify what exists between us. And then I'll ask you, in front of everyone, if you accept the bond. Not because destiny demands it, but because you choose it." Understanding flooded through her. "You're making consent part of the law. I'm making it the foundation of the law." Veyron turned to face her fully. "No more forced matches. No more Moonseers declaring bonds that wolves have no say in. From now on, both parties have to agree, publicly, witnessed. The other alphas will fight you on this. Let them." His voice was steady. "I have a Moonseer who can verify my bond is real. I have the authority of my bloodline. And I have the support of every wolf in this territory who's ever been trapped in a match they didn't want." He moved closer. "They can call a conclave. They can challenge me. But they'll lose." Ara felt something fierce and bright kindle in her chest. Not just the bond. Something that felt like hope. "You've thought this through." "I've thought about nothing else for 3 days." He stopped just in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "But I need to know you'll stand with me, that this is what you want too." She looked up at him, at the resolve in his eyes, the vulnerability underneath it. "You're asking me now? Before the ceremony?" "I'm asking you now because I need to know the answer isn't just for show. That when you say yes tomorrow night, you'll mean it." His hand lifted, hesitated, then cupped her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "I'm choosing you, Ara. Not the bond, not the political advantage. You. But only if you choose me back." The bond sang between them, bright and sure and absolutely certain. But beneath it was something more. Something that had grown in quiet rooms and honest conversations. Something that felt like the beginning of real love. Ara lifted her own hand, placed it over his. "I choose you," she said softly. "I chose you the moment I told you the truth, even knowing you might hate me for it." Veyron's thumb brushed her cheekbone. "I could never hate you. You came close. I came close to hating what you represented. But you," his expression softened, "you're nothing like what I expected, nothing like the stories. Good or bad?" "Better." He leaned down, pressed his forehead against hers. Just that simple touch, that moment of shared warmth. "So much better." They stood like that for a long moment, the bond humming between them. The choice they'd both made, settling into something solid, something real. Finally, Veyron pulled back. Tomorrow night, then, we'll face them together. Together. Ara echoed. He smiled. A real smile this time. It transformed his face, made him look younger, less burdened. Get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be long. He left before she could respond, but the warmth of his touch lingered on her skin. The certainty in his voice echoed in her chest. Ara sank back into her chair. Her hands were shaking. Not with fear, with something closer to exhilaration. Tomorrow, Veyron would stand before his pack and rewrite centuries of tradition. He would claim her not as a cage, but as a choice, and she would verify the bond between them with her gift, proving that destiny and free will could coexist. Her grandmother had been right. The next Alpha King would either restore or destroy the old ways. But she had been wrong about one thing. Veyron wasn't destroying the bond laws. He was transforming them into something better, something built on respect and choice and the radical idea that love should be freely given. The fire crackled softly. The library was warm and quiet. Ara pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the bond pulse steady and strong beneath her palm. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Marcus and the other alphas wouldn't accept change easily. There would be arguments, threats, maybe even violence. But for the first time since her grandmother's death, Ara felt certain of her path, certain of her choice. She'd found her purpose in this cold northern palace, found it in a scarred Alpha King who'd learned to see beyond tradition, who'd chosen to trust her even when every instinct told him not to. The bond hadn't brought them together. Not really. It had simply shown them what was already there. A connection worth fighting for, worth choosing every single day. Ara closed her eyes, let the warmth of it fill her completely, and waited for tomorrow night to come.